Hello, everyone. My name is Jana Marečková, and I'm the Canadian Accessibility Network's Program Manager. I would like to welcome you all to today's Can Connect Forum, Reflections on Accessibility, a conversation with Yazmine Laroche. We would like to begin today's event by acknowledging that the land on which the Carleton University is located is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and we are grateful to live and work in this beautiful territory. I have a few housekeeping items to share with you before we start the conversation. The Canadian Accessibility Network is a bilingual network. Our event today will be delivered in both official languages, and we will be providing captioning in both English and French, ASL and LSQ interpretation, and a simultaneous live audio translation so that you can follow along in your preferred language. Introducing our ASL and LSQ interpreters is always a good reminder for myself and everyone to try and speak at an even, moderate pace, not too quickly, so that they can capture everything that's being said. Any attendees who indicated they require ASL when registering for this event have been given multiple privileges so that you can pin each of the ASL or LSQ interpreters. Pinning highlights their videos on your individual screen. We will also be spotlighting our interpreters' videos throughout the event today. And we will do our best to ensure that the active interpreters are always on the screen. There are two ways to view the captions. The first way is to enable subtitles within Zoom. You can do this by clicking on the up arrow next to the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and then click View Subtitles or View Full Transcript. The second way is through an external link that's been provided by our captioner. We will be sharing two stream text links in the chat that will open up a separate window with the full transcript. There is one link for English transcript and one link for French transcript. For those who would like to listen to the event entirely in French or entirely in English, you can select interpretation, the globe icon in the Zoom meeting controls at the bottom of your screen, and select either French or English language channel. You will be able to hear the translated audio and also the original audio at a lower volume. If you cannot see the captions or encounter any other technical issues during the session, please put a comment in the chat and we will do our best to help you. For any attendees who are joining us over the phone, the controls you can use to interact with us during the meeting are *6 to mute and unmute yourself, and *9 to raise and lower your hand. And our last housekeeping note, for those who use screen reader or voiceover supports, we have been made aware that commentary or activity in the chat can be distracting and take away from our speakers. It is for this reason that we have adjusted our chat settings today, and you'll be able to chat directly only with me, your host, as well as with my co-host and my event support team. Thank you for your understanding. All right, so we'll get started with our event now by introducing our moderator and our guest. I will introduce each of you and then invite you to speak and introduce yourself. So we will start with our moderator, Tony LaBillois, who is the chair of CAN Advisory Council and the vice chair of CAN Governing Council. Tony, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yana. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est un plaisir pour moi de vous adresser la parole aujourd'hui en direct du territoire traditionnel non cédé de la nation Mi'kmaq en Gaspésie, surplombé de montagnes.
Gaspésie, and we have the beautiful mountains and beautiful sun as well today. And I'm the general director for the for Diversity and Population and Statistics Canada, and I'm also the champion since 2002 for people living with disability. And I think Jan already said everything else. So I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the warm welcome. Jana, go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Yazmine Laroche, who was Canada's first Deputy Minister for Public Service Accessibility in her role with the federal government. Yazmine, over to you.
Thank you, Yana, et merci, Tony, de cette belle invitation.
Thank you, Tony, for this beautiful presentation.
Scrolling through the faces on screen, and it's lovely to see so many familiar faces. So I'm thrilled to be here. For those of you who cannot see me, I'm a short woman with short, dark, curly hair. My face is light-skinned. I'm wearing very large glasses, kind of reddish, and I'm wearing a purple shirt that says, "The future is accessible." And as Yana said, I am a former deputy minister, having retired from a very lengthy career in the public service. I'm also a really, really proud alumna of Carleton University, and just so pleased to be here with this amazing community of people who are so devoted to the whole focus on getting rid of barriers and improving accessibility and participation for people who live with disabilities. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yazmine. And we are thrilled to have you both today with us. Tony, we can get started.
Thank you very much, Yana. I'm also thrilled. I'm wearing a tie for some of my friends who like it when I wear a tie. And I have a yellow shirt. I have short, I used to say dark hair, but I have to say gray hair now because I'm aging. And we're not here to listen to me. We're here to listen to Yazmine. Yazmine, when she was our champion in the public service for many years, and now is a very inspiring person. When I learned that she would be retiring last spring, I was shocked. I also was happy for her, for you, Yazmine. J'étais content que tu sois rendu là.
I was happy that you would be at that point, and as soon as I saw that message, I thought, oh, I have an idea. I want to invite her at a meeting like this one, to be able to take advantage of her wisdom and her inspiration that she brings all of us. So since your retirement, Yazmine, we're all very curious to know how things are going.
Bonne question. Comment ça va?
Thank you. How are things going? Well, it's going really well, actually. I can tell you that I'm really, really happy. I think I spent the first couple of months just sleeping. It was so important for me to have that period where I could really unwind and where I could really not think about work at the office.
It was really important for me to have time with my family. And of course, as we were coming out of the worst of COVID, to get back into travel mode. So I've had some wonderful trips. Spent a month in Arizona earlier this winter, and in a couple of days, I'm on my way off to Colombia. So so that has been a lovely bonus about my time since I retired at the end of June last year.
Fabulous. Now I'm excited thinking of eventually retiring myself when I see so many things that have happened in only a few months. What are your fondest memories of your time in the public service?
Oh, well, I'm old. I've had a long career, so I've got lots of memories and lots of wonderful things that I've been able to do in the public service. But you know, thinking about this audience and thinking about my last role, there's one memory that I have that really it stays with me, because I think it's very indicative of the challenges, but also the openness of people around accessibility. So I was a newly minted deputy minister in my first job, and this was my first time going to a cabinet meeting with my minister. And it was a very important file that we were bringing forward. It was a bit contentious. And for those of you who aren't familiar, the cabinet room, at least as it was back then, was a very, very large room, huge round table. And all the ministers sit around this huge round table with the prime minister in the middle and some key ministers on either side of the prime minister. And all the public servants have to sit on the side against a wall. And at the time, there were very strict rules about how we made interventions as public servants, and particularly to help simultaneous interpretation, because we had a translator's booth, you had to go to a podium with a microphone on it, so that if there were questions that the public servants had to answer, that's what we had to do. Well, as I mentioned, it was a very contentious file, having to do with issues related to marine safety and large tanker ships. And there were some very difficult questions that were being asked, difficult in terms of detail. And at one point, the minister turned to me to answer one of those challenging questions. And I'm in my scooter against the wall. I can't transfer out of my scooter. And that microphone on that podium didn't move either. So there I was, there was the podium, and the minister saw what was happening, and she leapt out of her seat and came running over to the podium and tried to physically move the entire podium over so that the microphone could reach me. It didn't work. So I ended up just having to really project my voice and hope that some of the microphones would pick me up so that the translators and the interpreters could do their job. That is, Tony, one of my fondest memories, because it was hilarious. It was a great learning opportunity, though. All those people sitting around that table instantly got to understand what a barrier is, and a barrier in like a very tangible way. And so I still remember it. I think so fondly of that minister and everything she did to try and help. And we still laugh about it. If I have the chance to run into her, we still laugh about that event. In the end, the presentation went really well, and our proposal was approved. So that was a good thing. So that's one of my memories. But Tony, I think really in general, what I say, my memories are the people, the amazing people that I've had the chance to work with all through my career. Also, the scope and the scale of the challenges that you get to deal with in the public service, and the amazing opportunity that you have to make a difference, which is unique to the public service, I think. So thank you. That's a great question.
You certainly worked on a lot of interesting files. When we look at your bio and your career, you had a vast number of key legislations or key programs to lead. Et puis, je me demande justement, qu'est-ce que tu as trouvé le plus intéressant dans tout ça?
So I'm wondering what you found the most interesting in all this. So you're talking about one facet, but I'm sure there are some files that were a little bit more special or interesting or important on a personal point of view. Well, I don't think we have enough time to really talk about all of the different things that I found interesting, because like I just said, it's the fact that we have the opportunity to really do things on a larger scale, things that are important. And what really surprised me, because when I arrived at the as a public servant, it wasn't with the intention of making a career out of it. It was really because I came from university. I was a graduate, and there were some significant costs associated to that. So I just wanted to make a bit of money so that I could reimburse all my debt. And I really had the impression when I started that this is what temporary, but all of a sudden all of a sudden I was really impressed by all the files, by all the fact that we have the opportunity to work in files that are going to have a direct impact on the lives of our of the Canadian people.
I don't have a family with a background in the public service. I didn't know what to expect. And I was just stunned by the breadth of the opportunity. So, I got to design a brand new program, for example, to transfer billions of dollars from the federal government to municipalities across this country. And that program is now permanent. It's a statutory program. It's a transfer now. And I got to work on that. I got to help design it. I got to engage with people across this country to talk about what they needed and to help try and figure out a way to make this work. That was an amazing opportunity. I got to work on broadcasting legislation in my career, which is, it was just an amazing opportunity to think about the role of broadcasting and what it plays in this in our lives as Canadians. I've worked on so many files that have just given me deep personal satisfaction. I designed a talent management program for senior executives in the public service. I got to learn about HR. And I think that's the thing when I think about the public service, it's the opportunity to contribute, but also the opportunity to learn and to tackle things that maybe you never thought you could do or would do. And it has been just the most amazing adventure. And so I'm really happy about that. And that has been, I think, what was most interesting. It's kind of the element of surprise about the whole career.
Yeah, and it totally resonates with me when you mention how we can learn and contribute and how it keeps us engaged as individuals and eventually as leaders in the public service. How did you see the public service evolve during your career, especially in terms of accessibility, diversity, inclusion, and equity for persons with disabilities, but also for persons with all kinds of walks of life, avec intersectionnalité des gens, avec toutes leurs caractéristiques et
So the intersectionality of all the people in the different dimensions that a person or that a society could have, and how it can evolve in, and how it could evolve in the public service.
Let me describe the public service when I arrived. So remember, I'm fresh out of university, want to pay down my student loan, and I was actually hired through a program that didn't exist for a very long time. And it was actually designed to bring in people with disabilities, and it would pay their salaries for 6 months in the hope that the department that was hiring them would keep them on. And so I arrived, and quickly I realized there was nobody who looked like me, especially not in leadership positions. There was a stereotype of what a leader was in the public service. It's a stereotype that has existed for a very long time, I would say. And that stereotype didn't look anything like me. It was typically white. It was typically male. It was typically an introvert. It was typically a policy wonk. And it was very typically not visibly disabled. Oh, yes. And it was often an economist, just saying. That wasn't me. I did not fit that picture at all. And I have seen so much change since I started. Look at the women in senior positions. The Public Service of Canada has led the world in terms of representation by women in the senior ranks. And it was a very intentional and deliberate thing that the public service did. And it's just wonderful to see, because all of a sudden, people can start to see people who look like them in these senior positions. And that gives you the opportunity to dream and to have some ambition. We're seeing now an added push on the full spectrum of diversity and representation. And again, a very conscious and intentional effort, because these things do not happen by accident. They really don't. You don't just wish your way into full representation. It requires effort and persistence and commitment. And we're seeing that. We're seeing a much more representative public service now, which makes me so happy. Because I will tell you this, I mean, I said I got hooked on the policy issues, but I didn't stay in the public service, especially not in the early days, because of, you know, the great things we were doing around accessibility and accommodations. I stayed despite the barriers. I stayed because I thought the work was so interesting. It was worth putting up with the barriers and the challenges that I faced. And so what an opportunity then to have as my last job, Deputy Minister for Public Service Accessibility, and take all of those things that I'd learned and try and work with people to come up with a strategy that would do many things, that would allow people to see themselves in the senior ranks and remove the barriers so that people can actually fulfill their potential. It's the single worst thing that we do, I think, as employers, as a society, is we create these barriers, and then people can't give their best, they can't be their best. And we lose out as a society, we lose out as a culture, we lose out as a country if we are actually not removing the barriers that let people get involved. So I'm very happy to see the progress that's been made. Obviously, there's still a really long way to go, though.
Merci pour cette réponse éloquente.
Thank you for that eloquent answer. Obviously, you maybe didn't have inspiration from certain leaders. For me in particular, and for several amongst us, you are, with time, you have become a source of inspiration. You'll be that for many people for a long time. And it's certainly what kept me so active and committed to be a champion. I've heard it from many people, actually, who work not only in accessibility, but also work as public servants in order to make it better than what we found it. And you've done a lot in accessibility in your last position, actually every time, to show that you couldn't stop with the barriers. You always have to look at the future and always find solutions to every issue. Unfortunately, you are no longer with us, but I do have to ask you, what do we still have to do? So what are you most proud of in terms of progress? And what do we still have to do that you would be proud to see accomplished in, say, 5, 10, 20 years? We know that the horizon is 2040, right, on the accessibility law, but where do you suggest that we head towards with all this? It's a big question. Yeah, it is a big question, Tony. I'm really proud of the fact that we have done a very important job to bring awareness, because like I mentioned in the past, we couldn't transform a system.
Rigoureux si on n'est pas on n'est pas très conscient de nos efforts. Mais pour ce faire, ça peut pas juste être une petite équipe. C'est un travail d'une équipe énorme. Alors, comme ça, il faut vraiment, nous avons fait énormément d'efforts de sensibiliser aux gens et je pense que c'est un travail qu'il faut continuer. Je suis également très, très, très fière du travail que nous avons fait et qui est encore en cours avec le passeport d'accessibilité, parce qu'on sait que c'est là où on a les plus gros défis encore. C'est en effet l'élimination des barrières, les accommodements en milieu de travail. On voit que ça continue à être vraiment un défi. pour les gens qui vivent avec des handicaps. I think from an employment perspective, we still have a really long way to go in terms of true representation. We still don't have enough people who self-identify with disabilities joining the public service. Our workplace representation levels are still too low, and they're low in the context of what we call labor market availability, and they're way lower in terms of general population levels. And I do think the public service has a leadership role to play in this regard. We need to demonstrate what's possible and what's right. And I still think we have a huge way to go in that regard. I mentioned, Tony, that I'm very proud of the work that we did on the passport, but I know it's still hard for people living with disabilities to access the supports that they need quickly to do their job. We're making progress. It's never fast enough. And I think 2040 is a really long way away. And so I think you're asking, you know, what do we still need to work on? We need accessibility and disability to become just part of the way we do things, and we're not there yet. It's not ingrained, it's not a reflex. It's still something that somebody has to think about and somebody has to hold others to account for. It's not just the way we do business. And that's when we'll know we're there, is when it's not the job of a small group of people to constantly remind others about why accessibility matters or why disability inclusion is important. It will just be the way we do things. And I'm optimistic. That's just my default. I'm an optimistic person. I do think we'll get there, but like I said, I think 2040 is a long way away. And I think the important thing, you mentioned that you were sad that I've left, Tony, but there's always a risk when an initiative is identified with one person or a group of people, small group of people, because it can, ça peut déresponsabiliser aux autres. Parce que il y a de nombreuses occasions, j'ai été dans des rencontres avec 40 autres sous-ministres et à chaque fois que quelqu'un disait le mot accessibilité ou le mot handicapé, c'était comme tout le monde autour de la table se tournait vers moi. Et je me suis dit, ça ne peut pas être juste ma responsabilité. Je ne peux pas devenir la Madame Accessibilité parce que là, ça donne comme la permission aux autres de dire, ah ben non, c'est Yazmine qui s'en occupe de ça. And so it's not why I left, but it's why when I retired, I thought this is actually a good thing and an opportunity so that it's no longer, oh, look at Yazmine, Mrs. Accessibility. No, it's everybody's business. And so my hope and what we still need to work on is making sure that it is seen as everybody's business.
Great wisdom, again, that's for sure. In my role as coordinating the advisory council of CAN, I'm impressed by what we can do together. How we're stronger together with people from different walks of life, from representing different organizations from the public sector, private sector, nonprofit, academics, and so on. And I always look for the best ways of trying to channel the energy and make sure that in that vast horizontal adventure towards more and more accessibility in Canada, we foster a climate that will be making us as a society and as an economy that is accessibility confident. But I'm always looking for advice on how we can better organize ourselves, not only in the public service, but much beyond across Canada, to make sure that we are more quickly successful in offering a more accessible Canada economically and socially. So your advice on that would be very interesting as well.
Well, I think you mentioned it. It's actually in your question, Tony. I think CAN is a tremendous example of how you continue to make progress. And it's kind of astonishing that when we think that CAN is very young as an entity, as a network, and it's volunteer driven. And so I think there's questions there. I think many of these initiatives start as volunteer driven, but at a certain point, it needs to become sustainable. And so I think there's a huge need now to think about how do you make sure that CAN is sustainable as an entity, because CAN contains the keys to making this progress. It involves people across the country from different disciplines, representing different disabilities, and is trying to create a holistic and integrated and national approach. And I think this is fundamental to making progress. One of the wonderful things about Canada and one of the awful things about Canada is that we're a federation. It means that it means that we can come up with solutions that are perhaps more appropriate to different regions of the country. But the downside of that is it also means that we end up with often these really unequal approaches across the country when it comes to things that matter to people in their day-to-day lives. Disability doesn't care what your postal code is. And so why do we have to have different levels of support and inclusion based on our postal codes? And I think that is, there are, we know that there are roundtables of ministers responsible for disability inclusion, of public servants across the country who get together. I think we need that kind of an approach. We need an approach that is cross-jurisdictional and that puts the individual at the heart of the conversation. It's not like, it should never start with, well, what do our regulations say? Or what do our standards say? That should never be the start of a discussion around inclusion and accessibility. The start should be the person. And what barriers are you facing that we need to get rid of so that you can make your best contribution? And I think a network like CAN is in a unique and wonderful position to actually tackle that and take that right across the country. I think the other thing is, and it's difficult right now because there's a lot of attention being paid to issues of diversity and inclusion, is to make sure that we're not pitting groups of people against each other for attention. And so I think working in partnership with other groups who are also seeking equitable outcomes is really, really important, because the other thing that disability doesn't care about, in addition to not caring about your postal code, it doesn't care about your gender, it doesn't care about your race, doesn't care about your religion. It just doesn't care. It can happen to anybody. And so I think it's really important that we be connected to other major movements around social change and justice.
Thank you very much.
Ça te va, Tony?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour cette réponse qui me fait encore réfléchir quand je t'écoute. Et je te remercie pour ça. Tu as parlé d'incapacité beaucoup dans cette réponse-là et que l'incapacité ne se souciait pas de nos autres caractéristiques pour même arriver à certains moments dans la vie, soit de façon épisodique ou permanente ou temporaire. Et certains d'entre nous sont nés avec certaines conditions, d'autres ont eu ça dans leur vie. L'autre chose qu'on se rend compte en te regardant ou en regardant plusieurs autres personnes qui font face à des limitations d'activité, c'est les aptitudes qu'on peut acquérir au cours de la vie. As we evolve as human beings, yeah, we can face an activity limitation or a new context that will suddenly make us face a barrier. But there's also how we can grow, how we can gain abilities. And I know how you've been involved with lots of us in the public service, inspiring us and giving us advice. And what kind of advice do you have for the young professionals that are joining or recently joined the public service, so that they make a difference in their career, so that they make a difference also towards more accessibility, more diversity, more inclusion, more equity for us in the public service, but also for the people we are there for all Canadians?
Well, that's another big question, Tony. You know, for younger professionals, what would I advise them? You know, the good thing is that we now have, and this is generally speaking, we now have an educational system that is putting a lot more emphasis on inclusion. And so as people are graduating out of that system and moving into paid employment, they're coming with different attitudes and different perceptions. And I think so there is a, you know, call it a generational shift, an attitudinal shift that's happening, where people just expect now that they're going to have equal access to opportunities. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing, to come into the workplace not feeling that you are only going to be able to do this much or only going to be able to do that much. There's it's a wonderful attitude that, well, of course I can do this, and why can't I do this, and why can't I achieve? The risk is that the system isn't designed yet to respond to that. That's the risk. The risk is that the system, because it's big and it's cumbersome and it's slow, isn't there yet. And so what happens to a young person who comes in full of enthusiasm and energy and wanting to make a difference, and it's going to take them a year before they get the accommodations they need so that they can actually do their work? Are they going to want to stay? Are they going to actually feel that the public service or any workplace that they're entering really wants them? And so I just, you know, I wonder, so that, you know, what advice would I give to a young professional? Speak up, advocate, find the networks that already exist in your workplace and join them and leverage them, because it's so much easier when you're working with a group of people who are committed to making the change that you want to see happen. And there are great networks now coming in all workplaces. So I think get involved in a network, agitate, speak up, talk to your managers, tell them what the barriers are. It's your manager's job to help you eliminate those barriers. It's not your job. Your job is to say there are barriers. It's their job to help you resolve them. And so work with your managers. I think that's hugely important. A lot of people also, you know, for somebody who maybe isn't currently living with any kind of a disability, but you're also, you know, you want to be involved, you want to help, you don't know what to do. I just say, look around you. Ask the people that you know who may be living with a disability, or the people you work with who may be living with a disability. Ask them about the barriers that they face, and look about you and see, well, is there something that I can do that might actually help eliminate some of those barriers? Is there some advocacy that I can do, or is there something actually in my sphere of influence that I can do that would, you know, help this person with dealing with the barriers that they're dealing with? I think the other thing I would say, just from a professional perspective, is I think this whole area of accessibility and removing barriers is it's a growth field. So for somebody who's thinking about what careers do I want to be in, wow, what a great career choice to actually develop some kind of expertise in the removal of barriers and helping organizations figure out how to design things without barriers. I think there is so much possibility in there. And I think the realm of accessibility is one that it actually requires a lot of creativity. And so I think it's a great opportunity for people who are creative to think about the kind of contribution that they can make. Back to you, Tony, while I try and refresh my throat.
OK. Merci beaucoup encore pour une excellente réponse. Je suis sûr que si j'étais tout nouveau dans la fonction publique, puis que je découvrais qui tu es, je serais certainement inspiré par ce que tu viens de dire. Il y a plus de presque 800 personnes qui se sont inscrites à cette conférence aujourd'hui, à cette discussion entre nous. Et tu as raison. Et vous pouvez tous, chacun de vous, parler de cette conférence à d'autres et devenir nos ambassadeurs un peu partout. Moi, je constate qu'il y a une très grande traction maintenant qui est engagée. On a une courroie de transmission avec plusieurs personnes pour aller vers un monde plus équitable, plus accessible, plus inclusif. Et puis, je me réjouis de voir ça aussi. La chose qui reste, c'est qu'on voit même après des années qu'il y a une grande hétérogénéité des barrières, comme tu le disais, ou des limitations d'activité ou de l'expérience que les gens ont dans leur milieu, que ce soit dans l'économie ou dans la société ou dans leur environnement personnel, professionnel, etc. Une grande hétérogénéité aussi dans le niveau d'acceptation de soi ou de perception d'acceptation des autres. Une grande hétérogénéité dans la façon créative. Tu as absolument raison que la créativité est très, très importante. La façon créative que les gens ont de se dépasser, de faire fi des barrières et de devenir capables de faire toutes sortes de choses qui les surprennent eux-mêmes, d'acquérir les aptitudes qu'il leur faut. Je m'en vais là parce que moi, je vois qu'il y a des endroits où c'est plus difficile, comme par exemple pour des types de réalités qui sont plus difficiles. Par exemple, après la pandémie, pour certaines personnes qui ne sont pas traditionnellement dans les gens qu'on identifierait ou qui s'identifieraient comme personnes handicapées, certaines personnes dans la fonction publique ou ailleurs ont trouvé qu'ils faisaient face maintenant à des limitations d'activité et qui avaient besoin d'accommodement pour eux-mêmes, et notamment pour beaucoup de choses invisibles. Et puis, on a toujours eu traditionnellement aussi des enjeux pour les gens avec des troubles de développement cognitif. Et puis, je me demande, toi, qu'est-ce que tu vois qui va bien, ce qui est sur la bonne voie, disons, mais qu'est-ce qui, encore là, reste à faire dans notre société ou dans notre économie? Tu en as parlé un peu, mais j'ose te faire revenir un peu sur ça dans cette partie de notre entretien. Parce que je pense encore là que tu vis toi-même peut-être certaines frustrations dans ta propre vie et que certaines autres personnes aussi, tu en as tellement côtoyé. Je pense qu'on devrait plus s'attarder à ces aspects-là en termes d'accessibilité. A very long question, but I'm sorry. Give you a chance to take your breath and have a drink, have a sip of water.
Non, de mon côté, c'est du café, Tony.
Oh, OK.
Je suis une bonne Colombienne, j'adore mon café. Alors, yeah, I'd be lost without my thermos of coffee. Keeps me going. It's a really interesting question. And it's, you know, I'm going to try and disentangle it a bit because there's a whole lot of different elements to it. So you talked about, you know, the creativity that a lot of people with living with disabilities have. And I do think it's an untapped resource. What it always made me, I found it ironic and sad that in my time in the public service, at least for the last 15 years of my career, there was this mantra about public service needs to innovate, needs to innovate. We're not innovative enough, we're not innovating. And like all the people that I know and all the people that I've met, without doubt, the most innovative and the most creative have been people living with disabilities. Because there is a mismatch, right? There's the world that we live in that is designed for, let's say, the 80%. And so those of us who don't constitute that majority, we have to find workarounds. And you can't always wait for somebody else to do it. So you're going to figure it out yourself. And it's that ability to think beyond the barriers that are in front of you and come and be creative. And yes, it's a shame that it's on us to have to do it. And yet it does result in some pretty amazing creatives. And so how do you harness that? How do you actually see that as an asset and not look at the person and not immediately assume they're a liability because of what you see as deficits? And so again, that's about attitude. And I think really the best way to change attitudes is just through numbers. Like the more people that you interact with who live with disabilities, the less scary it's going to be. And so that's why I keep coming back to employment. And I think it is so, so critical. And I think we really need to show leadership there. So I think that's one thing. Now, I think so we've talked about the network and the importance of taking a more integrated approach. I think it's so, so important. I think the other thing, though, that's very important is that often people think that a problem, I'm using air quotes, can only be fixed by big institutions, government, the banks, like big institutions have to fix things. But individuals do have a lot of agency and can actually make a difference. So one thing that I would say is at the individual level, don't wait for somebody else to take care of it, because you actually can make a difference wherever you are in your life, either by, if you're in a position to hire people, you get to decide who you hire. So think about who you hire and how you hire. Every day, we go out and we spend money. We buy coffee, we might go out for lunch. We make decisions about how we spend our money. How are we spending our money? There's a coffee shop that I won't name that went into business in probably the last year of my career. And they're not accessible. They're not accessible. It's like 3 steps to get in. And I would talk to people around me because they were not too far from my building. And I would say, you could actually make a difference. You could let them know that you're not going to patronize them. Yeah, you can go up those steps, but you could actually tell the owners that you're not going to spend your money there because they don't welcome people who can't climb stairs. And that is a very powerful thing that we can do at the level of the individuals. We can help raise awareness by how we spend our money. I think that is a very, very, very powerful thing to do. The other thing I would ask is, again, whether you're a manager or a colleague or a friend or a neighbor, what if you were just to say to somebody that you were aware of living with a disability, what can I do to support you so that you can actually make your best contribution, so that you can achieve your goals? What can I do? Sometimes it's just that asking that question that leads you into a very interesting conversation. You might be surprised at the things that you can do. So those are a couple of things. Tony, you talked about people with invisible disabilities as well. And I think what's so great about what's happening right now is this awareness. Because for too long, the discussion about disability was really just about visible disabilities, obvious disabilities, not about episodic, not about invisible or less visible disabilities. And one of the things that I'm really happy about is that we are taking a very comprehensive approach now to the definition of disability and an understanding of it. And I've heard one of the things that struck me the most when I was in my last job was the suffering of people who lived with invisible disabilities. And it was a very different kind of suffering because they had an option to disclose or not to. And by disclosing, they knew that they were risking living with prejudice and discrimination that they know happens to people with visible disabilities. And so the temptation is not to disclose. But if your invisible disability or your episodic disability means that you need accommodations to do your job really well, not disclosing can end you up in a labor relations context or a conflict management context, and you could end up being performance managed. So it's a terrible, terrible, imagine being faced with that choice. So I'm so happy that we're starting to pay a lot of attention to this, and I'm really glad. And again, we're learning a lot from post-secondary world, where so much attention is being placed to the real diversity that exists in disability. Tony, I don't know that I answered everything, but that was a very comprehensive question that you asked me. Alors, je ne sais pas si je vous ai donné les réponses, une réponse qui était suffisante, mais voilà.
C'était encore là excellent et très apprécié. J'ai une dernière question. Just before we go to that last question I want our audience to think of their questions, because we purposely kept half an hour for answering questions from the audience. So please prepare your questions either with using the chat or with raising your hand and showing up at the camera, even using sign language if you want to open your camera and interact with our interpreters in ASL or LSQ, you'll be welcome. La dernière question pour Yazmine, elle a trait pour toi à toutes les activités que tu as faites. Puis j'ai lu hier soir, juste pour le plaisir, un peu sur ta biographie. Je savais déjà certaines choses par rapport à ta carrière dans la fonction publique, mais j'ai vu que tu avais été animatrice de radio, de télévision communautaire, que tu avais même chanté dans un groupe local. Puis j'ai vu récemment que tu avais été nommé au conseil d'administration du Centre national des arts. Félicitations pour ça, mais pour tout l'ensemble de ton œuvre. Mais je me demande, on se demande quels sont tes projets? Parce que c'est pas parce que tu as pris ta retraite que tu vas être inactive. Tu es comme, à peu près comme moi, là, je suis sûr que tu es incapable d'être inactive du jour au lendemain. Là. Je suis curieux de savoir qu'est-ce que tu as à nous dire là-dessus.
Bon, merci encore, Tony. Oui, j'ai pris une pause pour vraiment faire une réflexion parce que je voulais pas juste sauter à la prochaine étape. Je voulais vraiment prendre le temps de réfléchir et de penser, mais qu'est-ce que moi je veux faire? And, it's hard. So I'm coming to you today from my office, my home office. And it's, sometimes I have to slap myself because, I mean, not physically, but you know what I mean. Because the temptation and that is so great to just kind of replicate what you did before. Like we do things by habit, you get up at the same time. So I find myself every day, I get up at a certain time, I have my thermos of coffee, I come out here to my office and I fire up my computer and I start doing work. So I'm involved in different initiatives and I find myself like by 4 o'clock in the afternoon going, wow, I just spent an entire day in front of the computer. How is this different? And it's like this little light bulb went off in my head and I thought, but I don't have to sit in front of the computer from 8 to 4 or 9 to 5. I can spend the afternoon playing the piano if I want to. And so part of the challenge I'm finding about retirement is not replicating what I did before and how I did things. So after I had my little petite pause, I became aware of some opportunities, and I decided that I was going to be selfish and do things that really mattered to me personally. And as Tony mentioned, earlier in my life, I did have the opportunity to work in community radio and television, and I was also very interested in music, the performing arts, and so I thought I'm going to look for those kinds of opportunities. And so I'm doing two things right now. So I just joined the board of the National Arts Center, which is wonderful. It's an institution that I've just loved for so long. And I'm really, really happy to have joined this board and to get to help oversee the strategy, I guess, of a major cultural institution that I'm so fond of, and that's doing a lot of amazing work around diversity and inclusion and accessibility. So I think it's a great time for me to be there. I've just joined a new organization. It's a startup, and it's called the Disability Screen Office. And I'm super, super excited about this. I'm the chair of the board. We're a very small organization. We are just starting up. And the goal of this organization is to remove the barriers and make the screen industry in Canada more accessible, and to improve the representation of people with disabilities in the screen industry in Canada, both in front of and behind the camera. And I just think this is such an amazing organization and initiative, and it combines so much of of what I care about. It is about the cultural industries, and it's about accessibility and removing barriers. And so it is, I'm super, super excited. And I think it's just, I'm so happy that I get to do that. Of course, I continue to fight and push and advocate. And somebody just reached out to me last week to ask me if I'd like to start doing some consulting on accessibility. And I thought, that could be interesting. So I would just say, Tony, that I think it's very important for me, I have to feel like I'm doing something worthy, and I love to make a difference, and I love to work with people, and I love to give advice. So I'm looking for those kinds of opportunities. And of course, I'm also honoring my commitment to my family, which is more time with them and more time to travel, and to just be very present in the lives of people I love so dearly. So it's life is good. Je peux pas me plaindre.
Merci beaucoup, Yazmine. Now it's going to be turned to you with questions. So I'll leave Yana managing that question period, and I'll be there very closely in the background in case I also might want to react to some of the questions that you will all ask to Yazmine.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, Yazmine, for all your replies so far. We have a few questions. I would just like to remind everybody, there are a few ways how you can ask questions. You can raise your hand, or you can put your questions in the chat in English or in French. We will start with the first question by Phil Turcotte.
Bonjour, merci. Merci Yazmine, c'est toujours un plaisir de t'entendre puis d'avoir la chance de connecter avec toi. Donc, I think before I get to my question, I'll offer a commentary in relation to a question you answered, if I can, since we have a captive audience. As an employee with disabilities, I think there was a question about like what can non-disabled employees do to make things more inclusive. The one tidbit I'd have is, when you're planning events, whether they're in the office or outside of the office, make sure your venue is accessible. plan that ahead and make sure you make that information about the venue easily accessible for folks from the beginning, so that we don't have to worry about, will we be able to go to the office Christmas party? Will we be able to go to someone's retirement party? And then have to ask after the fact, is this accessible? Have you thought of me? Do that from the very beginning. That's something that you, as a person without a disability, can do very easily to inform yourself about accessibility, but also increase awareness. Because if more of us ask venues if they're accessible, then venues will realize that there's a market for offering accessible venues. So sorry about that little spiel, but it's one of my burning kind of frustrations as an employee with disabilities, because this often seems left out. Yazmine, I wanted to ask you what recommendations you would have for employees that want to create their own networks for employees with disabilities, by employees with disabilities, how they might go about doing that, and why that kind of a network is important. Because I think they are different from like management involved advisory committees. I think they're a different creature. And I've struggled in the different places that I've been to try to bring those committees together. So I'd love your thoughts on why those kinds of for people with disabilities, by people with disabilities committees can be helpful. Merci.
Oh, merci, Phil. And I'm so happy to see you there. And check your email, because I think I sent you one last week.
Yes, I owe you an answer.
Okay. A couple of things on networks. So thank you so much, though, for the advice. Like, that's super important and practical advice. And it's the idea of accessibility by default, right? So you want, like, it's such an easy thing for a manager to do to make sure that events are accessible. You just ask the venue. And I can't tell you the number of times I didn't attend things because they weren't accessible, and inevitably it was left too late. So I think that is a great way to help people feel that you are welcome. In terms of networks, thank goodness for social media and easier opportunities to connect. I think it's really, really important. I know how lonely I felt when I started in the public service, because I mentioned there was nobody else like me. I finally met one other person who had a physical disability, and we just connected and we became really good buddies. And it was just so great to have somebody that you just didn't have to go through long explanations with, and you could just like, you could, on prend des choses comme acquis. And so like, it was just like, oh yeah, one of my peeps. And it was so great. And I think everybody needs peeps. You really do. And it's not that you want to be exclusive, but it's so important to have a space where people, they understand where you're coming from. You're not having to explain yourself, and you can support each other. I mean, it's so wonderful to have people that are going to be there for you. So I just think it's a natural way to operate, and you don't need permission to do that. That's the other thing. Anybody can create any network. You can do your virtual coffee club. You can do a physical coffee club, and you don't need to wait. And I think it's, you never know what you're going to discover. So I think it's a super idea, Phil.
Thank you, Yazmine. Next question. Yazmine, do you have any advice for those struggling to gain acceptance of their disabilities through the duty to accommodate process?
Yeah, is it the acceptance of the disability or acceptance of the accommodation request? So I don't know what the context of the question is. I don't know what kind of challenge, because there could be, there's so many different ways that I could answer that question, because there's so many different examples. So for example, if your manager is saying, well, I don't believe you, well, that's a problem. And, I think now, I don't know, I know there's a lot of work, and forgive me because I haven't been there now since last June. There's a lot of work being done kind of to bring together the work that's being done on the updates to the duty to accommodate with the accessibility passport. And I think that's really important because, one of the things that is awful is that people constantly being asked to provide medical explanations as opposed to a focus on a description of the barrier. So, and again, I think that's the problem. Like we try and medicalize things. So the issue becomes, well, you prove to me that what you say is wrong with you is truly wrong with you, as opposed to the approach being, tell me about the barriers that are keeping you from making your best contribution. And what do I need to do as your manager to get rid of those barriers? So that's a very different conversation because it's not about a condition then, it is about barriers. And again, a couple of thoughts. So, your bargaining agent should, you should be getting support from your union if that's a problem. The employee network where you happen to work, really, really, really important. I think the worst is when you feel like you're doing it all on your own. So I think it's finding those venues where you think you can, where you're going to have some people to support you and help you in this. But again, I also think the issue is the way we approach the issue of accommodations and accessibility. And we always seem to make it about, tell me what's wrong with you, and then we'll see if we can help you fix it. As opposed to tell me about the barriers that you're facing and how do we get rid of them so that you can actually give your best here. And I, that's training, that's learning how to have a really good conversation as a manager. There's a lot of work still that needs to be done, but I would suggest to the person who's having those challenges, there are two things you can do. And one is find your network, talk to your union, and see what kind of support you can get from them.
Thank you. The next question is from Robin. What would be a key performance indicator to measure accessibility maturity of department or agency?
Oh, that's a tricky one. It depends. Well, metrics are interesting. And there's so many different ways you can get at that. So one of the things, all right, there's a couple of different ways you can get at this. One would be if you're doing an annual employee survey. So we know in the public service that people with disabilities have disproportionately high reporting of harassment and discrimination. So that's a really important one to track, because when we actually try to dig deep and understand that, what was driving it was lack of accommodations and lack of access to a workplace and that worked for you. So that's a really good way to track maturity. Are your employee engagement scores starting to look the same regardless of how a person self-identifies? That is a really, really good one. There are other, so these are kind of like indirect indicators. So another thing that I would track that I think is really, really important is how many people who self-identify as living with a disability are being given what we call in the public service acting opportunities or short, temporary assignments. In other words, what is the career progression looking like of an individual who lives with a disability, who has self-identified? Tracking career progression is really important. Tracking where people are. So the first time we tried to do an analysis of where people with disabilities in the public service were, we found that they were disproportionately overrepresented in clerical and administrative functions and in HR. So, this is what we do, right? Organizations love to have people who identify as belonging to different identity groups or diversity groups and put them into HR so that they can run the diversity and inclusion shops. When I started, after those first 6 months were done, the head of HR asked me if I wanted to go work in HR and help them. And I said, no. I wanted to be a writer, so I didn't want to work in HR. And I think, so tracking where people with disabilities are, I think is really, really, really important. Where do we find them? What are their promotion rates like? So these are some things, but oh my goodness, Robin, like there are so many indicators, but I do think engagement scores and where people are and what their career progression is looking like, I think are really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Yazmine. Next question, Sarah N has her hand up, so I'll ask Sarah to ask her question, please.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I just keep losing the interpreter, and now we've lost Sarah Ann. Just wait 1 second. Okay. Okay, Sarah Ann and the interpreter are both spotlit now. Thank you so much, Yazmine. I really appreciated your talk and your answers. It was great to see you speaking. I am deaf, using sign language, ASL, and I just did go through the promotional process. I tried to get a promotion. It was very challenging. Access to interpreting was extremely limited. Interpreter services. Accessibility in other ways, accommodation was very limited. And so my needs were, for the accessibility passport, were that I needed an interpreter on my team, so that I could access what I needed to make that promotion. So I had to carry my passport around and make sure that my accommodations were understood. So that passport wasn't only for equipment and technology, but it actually can be for a person. And in my case, it was to get a person, an actual human being, an interpreter. So my dream is to get more promotion, and I need an interpreter on my team who understands me and can be my voice. And I work for the Procurement Canada, and so I do talk to a lot of businesses. I make a lot of presentations. I go to conferences. I encourage diversity in the bidding process and the federal procurement process, and making recommendations on purchases and procurement. I need to be able to be understood. I need a voice. So I need a good interpreter. And that has been a barrier for me, and I know that other people experience other barriers, and I know that I'm not alone. But one thing that I have experienced is I have noticed that accessibility takes place in silos within the government. That there is sometimes accessibility in one area, but it's not always equitable across the public service. So there sometimes is, it's challenging to get accessibility across the board in the federal government. I don't know how many, I think there's probably over 100, maybe over 100 people who, need this kind of accessibility, and we're not, there's policies that are established, but we are not, connecting that always to accessibility, because there are different points of view as well. And so we just need to break down some of these barriers to people who have various accessibility needs and accommodation needs. We don't all need the same thing. So I'm just wondering, Yazmine, what's your opinion on that? I know it's a long question. It's a big question. It's multi-layered and faceted, but maybe you can take a stab at that.
Well, thank you, Sarah Ann. That's a comprehensive question. So let me comment first on interpreters. One thing that we've noticed is that there's a shortage right across this country of qualified interpreters. And so again, in terms of my previous comment about why accessibility is a great business line, like I think the field of interpretation has lots of opportunity, and I would love to see more people getting involved. And I agree. I'm really glad that it's in your passport, and I'm so happy that you mentioned the passport isn't just about things, because barriers aren't just physical. There's all kinds of barriers, and that the passport should cover all of that. I think your point about the unevenness and the silos across government is very, very apropos. We're a huge, the public service, because I'm not a we anymore. The public service is huge, and it's diverse, and it's got, it's not the same, right? Different departments have different types of business. Some are very operational, some are very policy oriented. And so it's difficult to have, it makes it challenging sometimes to have a more consistent approach, which is why I think something like the passport is so important, because the passport doesn't care where you work. It just says these are the barriers that you face and this is the fix. And I think we need more of that. And I think, you know, my ambition was that the passport would just be available and used right across the public service. I think that would do a lot to start to get that consistency to happen. I think we still need a lot of training and education. We did a lot of work with the Canada School of Public Service to try and embed accessibility into their different program offerings, because it's not just you go and do a like accessibility 101 program and you do that for, you know, you take a 3-day course and now you've learned everything. That's a good introduction. But I think for that mind shift to happen, it needs to be embedded. It doesn't matter if you're doing a procurement course, or if you're doing a contracting course, or if you're doing a course on how to be a good manager. Accessibility needs to be embedded into it. Otherwise, it's always going to be something over there, something that somebody else will take care of. And I think the one thing that I've learned, and the one thing I'm hoping that people are learning, is that it's everybody's business. And so that's the change. So Sarah Ann, you just keep getting those promotions, and you just keep pushing and keep agitating and advocating and grow that network. Because as you move up and you progress, you're going to be a great example for other people about what's possible. And again, it helps to demystify. And I know we hate sometimes being role models, but sometimes we have a tremendous opportunity, particularly the higher up we go, to actually make some of that change happen. So please stick to it, Sarah Ann.
Thank you, Yazmine.
Thank you.
The next question is related to self-identification. How do we encourage staff in our agencies to do this voluntarily when there really is no benefit to the employee, and it seems that it only gives the agency department a check in a box?
Well, you can't force somebody to self-identify. It's a very personal issue. I did not self-identify for a long time because I was worried that I would be discriminated against because I had self-identified. That's a legitimate concern. I eventually decided to do it, and by then I was an executive, because I thought it was important that, from a statistical perspective, because it's hard to know how representative you are if you don't have a good data set. But you can't force people to do it. You can encourage people to do it. I think people with lived experience of disability who do self-identify maybe could share why they do it with others. I think it's a difficult stance for management to take, if you know what I mean. I think it would be easier if it were somebody who already has and can explain what motivated them personally. But as soon as it's, management says you should do this, I think the natural reaction from an employee could be, well, why? What's in it for me? And if you can't, as an organization, demonstrate what's in it for somebody, then why would they? So I think the responsibility of management is not to say, here's why you should self-identify. The responsibility of management is to be seen to be doing great things around accessibility and disability inclusion that will then make people feel that there is perhaps a benefit, or at least there's not a risk to self-identifying. So it's a very different approach, but I think there's always a risk when management says you should do this. That's not a good enough reason. People need to see that there's not going to be a risk and that there may actually be a benefit. But the first thing that management needs to do is to create that welcoming environment that gets rid of that fear factor.
Thank you, Yazmine. We'll have time for one last question. It's related. What advice would you give to an employee disclosing an invisible disability and requesting workplace accommodations for the first time?
What advice would I give you? I'd say good for you for taking this on. It's really important for people to understand that barriers aren't just physical. There are other kinds of barriers that people have to deal with. And the thing is, if people don't know about the barriers that you face, they're not going to be able to do anything about it. And I know it's getting over that hesitation of that first step of saying, oh, but these are the barriers that I face. Again, if people don't know what those barriers are, they may just keep on recreating them, and you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're struggling with those barriers. But again, it's your call, it's your decision. And I think my point would be, if there are barriers that are stopping you from doing the great things that you want to do, then I think you should let people know. But you have to decide, and you're the one who's in the best position to decide whether those barriers are great enough that it's worth discussing. And only you can decide that.
Thank you. Looking at the time, we have time for one more question. I work in the area of supplier diversity, specifically in the area of disabled-owned businesses in Canada. We are one of the very few support organizations in this country for businesses owned by people with disabilities. Do you know of any government plans to provide this much needed support and recognition?
Sorry, I just lost my mouse. Okay, I think I've unmuted now. Wow, I think you should ask Sarah Ann that question, because she works in procurement and I don't. However, there are a lot of initiatives in government underway right now to help target some of government procurement towards organizations that are run by, they're women-owned, Indigenous-owned, Black-owned, and disability-owned. So there are, but I don't have the details. I would think that somebody like Sarah Ann, somebody from Public Services and Procurement Canada, would be best positioned to answer that. But I think it's one of the things that we ask, like, where's our inventory of these companies, so that people know that they're there, because that's the first thing that people will say to you is, well, I don't know where to find it. So if somebody's got an inventory, that starts to make things a whole lot easier for people who are looking to who need firms to supply them with different materials or people. So I think that would be a wonderful thing if you could be connected to our friends at Public Services and Procurement Canada. So no pressure, Sarah Ann, but I'm suggesting that maybe you can help.
Thank you, Yazmine. This is all the time we have for our discussion today. Thank you, everyone, for your comments and questions. Tony and Yazmine, the floor is yours now for your final remarks.
Merci beaucoup, Yana. Chère Yazmine, je peux te dire que je suis rempli de gratitude actuellement. Je tiens à te remercier très sincèrement pour ta générosité aujourd'hui, pour tes nombreuses contributions depuis de nombreuses années dans la fonction publique et au-delà dans la société canadienne. Je suis convaincu que ces contributions vont se poursuivre quand je vois ton ardeur, ton énergie, ton engagement. Nous sommes chanceux de te connaître. Merci pour ton amitié, non seulement envers moi, mais envers beaucoup de gens qui ont croisé ton passage. We're lucky to know you. We're lucky to count on your wisdom. We're privileged to hear from you today, and I'm very thankful. I'm also very thankful for the people that organized this, to all the people that organized this. Big thank you to the National Office of Carleton University some of my colleagues at StatsCan as well, and some other staff at Carleton. You made a difference in making this event possible, and we really appreciate that. Thank you also to each of you. More than, well, close to 800 people registered to this event. That means a lot to all of us who organized this and who are part of the Canadian Accessibility Network or who have worked in accessibility. If you took the time to come today, that means a lot to us. It means that we have allies, that we have ambassadors, that together with you, we can all make a difference, as Yazmine told us, in our environment, in what is under our power to change as individuals or with our professional roles, your professional roles. There's something that comes from the heritage of Yazmine. Nothing without us. Rien sans nous. Une devise pour dire que les personnes en situation de handicap, les personnes avec une limitation d'activité, même qui ne se considèrent pas nécessairement handicapées, mais qui font face à des barrières, rien sans les consulter. Rien sans nous, mais nous sommes beaucoup plus avec Yazmine. Nous sommes beaucoup plus avec vous aussi. So, nothing without us, but much more with Yazmine and much more with each of you. Alors, merci beaucoup à vous tous. Et le mot de la fin à Yazmine avant de repasser la parole à Yana.
Merci, Tony. C'était vraiment un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui, avec tout le monde. Heureusement, je n'étais pas capable de visionner 800 personnes parce que ça aurait été trop de pression, je pense, pour moi, et trop de stress. Mais en tout cas, ça m'a fait énormément de plaisir. You know, Canadian Accessibility Network, like I said, combines two of my great loves, Carleton University and accessibility. And what a great chance to just hang out with you guys today and to spend some time with my pal, Tony, and to talk about something that we all care about so deeply and that each one of us has committed to fixing in some way. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think I'm so optimistic about the future because of everybody on this call, people like you who are just every day doing what you can to make Canada better, to remove barriers, and to really, really move things forward in terms of accessibility. So in French, we like to say, ne lâchez pas. Don't stop, don't quit. It takes perseverance and it takes a huge network and people like you. Thank you so, so much. And who knows, I hope our paths may cross again sometime in the future.
On behalf of the Canon National Office, I would like to sincerely thank Yazmine and Tony for their time today and their openness during the discussion. It was very informative and gives us all something to think about to help push accessibility forward. Thank you everyone for attending today. We will be sharing a link to our feedback form, which we ask that you please fill out to help us keep developing and improving our Can Connect forums. If you have questions or want information about getting involved in CAN, please don't hesitate to contact the national office at can@carleton.ca. The email address will be shared in the chat. We hope to see you all at our next Can Connect forum. Stay tuned for more information. We'll be sharing a link to our registration and information page. And thank you and have a great afternoon.